Before I start, I'd just like to get a quick idea of who's been actively engaged in pseudonymisation programs in the audience. So if you've been engaged in this kind of work to date, could you please raise your hands now? Okay. Slightly lower than I thought. Now, in a conversation last night with my wife, we were discussing pseudonymisation over a cup of cocoa, and we were thinking of ways in which we could communicate how pseudonymisation is a multifaceted, varied discipline. And we came up with the following technique, and we thought of pseudonymisation as a degree. So if you took pseudonymisation as a degree course, what would it entail? What types of disciplines would you need to understand in order to become a master of the subject? So we settled on the following. So the modules would include the legal aspect, information governance, statutory information, cryptography in terms of how you actually physically change the data into its pseudonym equivalent. You would need sector-specific knowledge to the sector you were delivering the solution into, such as NHS, local or national knowledge, or judicial knowledge, or even academic. You would need knowledge of things such as the ISO standards, which are governing the development of solutions of this type globally. And also, of course, you would need knowledge on the technical systems, data, architecture and platforms. And as it's quite, the field is burgeoning, but it's still in its infancy, I feel. And to get one person who's got an absolute total knowledge of all of these is quite a challenge. And so, if you're implementing solutions like this, you need to have a very strong feel for each one of these areas to understand the type of solution that you're putting in. If I was a lecturer, I will be lecturing the more technical side of the syllabus. So the remainder of this presentation will focus on some of the more technical aspects without going into too much detail, because first of all, though, we can touch on what is secondary use. So data that needs to be pseudonymized is data that is commonly termed as secondary usage data. And the best way of explaining this is to say, well, what is primary data? And primary data is when you go into a hospital and you give your information over to the practitioner. This is a primary direct use of information. When that information is transferred to, say, a primary healthcare trust or to a contract monitoring team, at that point it becomes secondary, and it is under that usage situation that you need to pseudonymize data. And listed, I've got some usages there, such as research, audit, commissioning, contract monitoring, and so on. Identifiable data. So I've got up here a list of certain data that could be that if you were to release information to, inadvertently to somebody who wasn't supposed to have access, then this information could mean that an organisation is in breach of the Data Protection Act. Now, it's important to note that a name, obviously, and an address would give away the identity of an individual, but you can also give away the identity of an individual by giving out their postcodes along with, say, a patient pathway identifier. There are other data elements which are less obvious, which will identify a patient, not just the name, not just the address. There are other aspects to this, and there's a quite wide-ranging list of data items published by Connecting for Health, which give a very clear and concise outline in terms of the data items that you do need to pseudonymize if you are putting in a system of this nature. Now, obviously, if you're putting in a pseudonymization system, there is going to be an impact, because to date, people have been able to get to the information that they need to access in a very quick, timely manner. And as we move forward into the future and these systems become more and more commonplace, there is going to be an impact. Now, in the time we've spent with our clients, there have been impacts. All of them are manageable, but they are impacts nevertheless. And they are concentrated on two particular aspects. The first of which is people. So if you're a person and you're used to having data on a regular basis and there aren't any questions asked about that information, then you are going to notice a change in the new way of doing things. So you will find that your information is limited by the role that you have within the organisation. And if you can't get access to that information, there is going to be an impact maybe on your job, maybe on a task that you're doing for another colleague. Now, this is the first impact, and that is created by what's known as RBAC, or role-based access control, and that is the feature that actually gives you access to data. And as we go into, as pseudonymisation becomes more and more eminent in NHS organisations, there is going to be more segregation and more limitation on the data that you can access. The second organisational impact is on business processes, and this is a really huge piece of work that each organisation has to go through in order to achieve compliance with the IG Toolkit Level 2. So there are a list of various processes that each organisation has to adhere to, such as the creation of a new safe haven, that's one of them, and you must get to Level 2 in each of these competencies in order to be on the right side of the advice and recommendations from CFH and from the ICO as well. Now, the establishment of these processes is a really huge undertaking. It's much bigger than a technical piece of work in its own right, and it can take, I know programs that have taken 2 years from start to finish, where the technical part of it could be less than 40%. I'm going to come on to now specific techniques for the pseudonymisation of data, so that the presentation is going to take on a slightly more technical slant from this point forwards. And what I want to show you is some source data. So this could be a file that represents a particular cohort, it could be a downloaded data file from SUS, or it could be information that's transferred from GP to GP. And within that, let's say I've got my NHS number in there, which is 1111122222. Now, that information could be pseudonymised in multiple ways, the first of which is encryption. So my number, when pseudonymised, could create an encrypted value, and this value would be much longer than my NHS number, which would be typically 10 digits long. The second way which you could potentially pseudonymise data would be via a randomisation engine, where you take the NHS number, you feed it through a code routine, and this information then would create an alternative NHS number which would be much more similar to the original than an encrypted number. Now, it's important to note that you can create a pseudonym for each instance of a person's NHS number. So I could have 15 pseudonyms floating around an organisation, which are all pseudonyms which relate to my identity, but they are all different. And these two techniques are the best way of creating those types of pseudonyms. But to conform with IG Toolkit requirement 8324, which is that you must have a thing called multiple pseudonyms, you need to create what's called a linked list. And a linked list allows the reuse of my personal pseudonym throughout that organisation. And linked lists can be encrypted linked lists, they can be randomised linked lists, or you can use things such as, you can switch the NHS number with my date of birth for all patients. But that way of doing things is slightly dangerous, in that once you discover that the date of birth has been switched with an NHS number, you've got a problem, because all the patients then become identifiable. And with each one of these techniques, as the next slide will show, there are various trade-offs associated with each. So encryption is incredibly robust, it's very hard to crack, but the downside of it is that you do need to manage the encryption keys, and that is an additional maintenance and additional overhead within your solution. Randomisation, incredibly easy to implement, but it's very easily compromised, as are the transposition of columns. So if I was to switch again, NHS number with date of birth, once you identify that those two data items have been switched, it's very easy to uncover everyone's identity within the system. But with linked lists, you do get the benefit of being able to reuse pseudonyms, and this is an absolutely critical part of any pseudonymization solution, that you should be able to reuse pseudonyms for a given person, so that within a particular context, such as an inpatient context, my NHS number would remain the same, but only to authorised individuals. In my next part, I'm going to describe how you can prepare data before it goes into a pseudonymisation engine or into a new safe haven. So I've got two approaches to show you, the first of which is part of the ISO specification. And in this specification, you get some data, and it typically contains clinical and patient identifiable data. So it may have my clinical history as well as my name. And what the ISO say you should do is that you can split information out into what's known as PID, or patient identifiable data, and non-PID, or payload information. And then the PID data gets fed through the DID engine to create its pseudonymized equivalent. And then that data is rejoined back to its clinical data. Now the second approach is slightly different and slightly more straightforward, in that you take data from source and then you load the information row by row into the engine. And then row by row, you only de-identify the columns that actually require it, such as name, address, date of birth, and so on. And then you load that row to the new safe haven. And then you take the next row and you continue in a looping mechanism until you've reached the end of the data. Now, one of those approaches is favoured by the International Standards Organisation, and one of them is a pretty new approach that's appeared in the last 12 months. Our feeling at Oka-Bi is that approach A is slightly risky, in that if you were to rejoin the wrong clinical history to the wrong patient, then I can leave that up to your imaginations. It could be quite a fundamental issue that would occur within the trust that implemented this incorrectly. Approach B seems to be a much more simpler and more manageable and a more maintainable way of doing things. Finally, I want to talk about the new safe haven. Now, going back to the previous slide, you can see information is loaded to a new safe haven. Now, the new safe haven typically, although it could be one database, typically is modelled as two, and this is in line with the Connecting for Health requirements. So to support things such as data validation, so you could validate an NHS number using the modulo 11 algorithm, or you could derive age from date of birth. Both of these functions should occur in the clear data repository of the new safe haven, whereas things such as, or functions such as linkage, pseudonymization and de-pseudonymization, which is the actual reversal of the process, would then be affected within the pseudonymized data part of the new safe haven. So both of these repositories coexist within the organizational new safe haven. And it's important to note that you cannot do derivation and validation on pseudonymized data. You do need, unless the data is actually very similar to the original. So in the clients that we've spoken to and worked with, they tend to go with this model, and it's a model that was initially proposed by the DOH some years ago. So in conclusion, pseudonymization only applies to secondary data. There are various techniques that you can use to pseudonymize data, such as encryption, linked lists, and randomization. But it's important to note that each technique has a trade-off, and there is no one perfect way of designing a solution. It can be different for every individual trust. It all depends on what your local requirements are. Data can be prepared in many different ways, it can be loaded in many different ways, and a new safe haven supports multiple functions. It's important to note also that that audit is a mandatory requirement of any new safe haven that is fit for purpose. You need to maintain an audit trail of every individual access to patient data by each individual person, and that is an absolutely fundamental feature. And finally, as you can see, there are so many different types of solution ranging on your requirements. So there are integration components, there are enterprise self-service solutions, and there are also all open source solutions that we know of as well. So depending on what your specific requirements are, these are the types of options that you would particularly typically look at going forwards. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you.